The front line, as we have understood it, has disappeared. It's gotten replaced with a kill zone of about 30 kilometers, and anything that goes anywhere near there is directly targeted and annihilated. That's why we
By
have...
whom? By Russia or Ukraine or both?
By both, because it's an environment completely saturated with drone presence, which means it's absolutely transparent. You cannot go inside there and film something because you'll be killed the moment you move. The technology which now dominates the battlefield, it allows both sides to see at night, to see based on the heating that a body can, for example, produce, or an animal can produce, or a vehicle can produce. The use of artificial intelligence is changing the targeting, the precision.
So what you're describing in a way is a cyberpunk version of World War I. So this weekend was a really extraordinary one in the history of the Ukraine-Russia war. It seems for not the first time ever, but perhaps in the most intense attack yet by Ukraine on the Russian capital, there was just drones and cruise missiles hitting parts of the Russian capital.
Ебать! Охуеть! Ой, ёбаный в рот. Ебать, сейчас звук будет. 7. Это пиздец.
Some will say this is a taste of the Russians' own medicine because they've been hitting Ukrainian cities, and this was a way to bring the war to Muscovites who've been relatively sheltered from the conflict. On the other hand, is it going to provoke a large Russian counter-response? Is it going to open up Ukraine and its NATO partners to allegations that they are engaging in the same kind of no-holds-barred warfare as the Russians? I am Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com, or you can subscribe on YouTube or on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And we're lucky today, really, this was not planned, but we have with us Anastasia Shapochkina. She is the director and founder of the Eastern Circles. It's a Paris-based think tank, and she's also a member of the Sciences Po Paris faculty. She is a Ukrainian analyst and scholar, outspoken, very, very cool person. I actually met her in Paris a couple weeks ago. We had an amazing conversation about the Gulf, Ukraine, Iran, how they're all interconnected, really heady stuff. But I guess we should just talk, Anastasia. Hi, first of all.
Hello, Borzu. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you as well. I guess we should just, first of all, just talk about what happened this weekend and what it means in the overall context of the Russia-Ukraine war. Was this a watershed moment of any sort?
To me, this is rather a result of a steady build-up of Ukrainian capacity to hit back. And this hasn't happened overnight. It is, to me, a continuation of a growing military capacity, offensive capacity, which Ukraine has finally built up to the point of it being worth talking about. And that is basically becoming the best Ukrainian guarantee, security guarantee. It's Ukrainian capacity to defend itself with its own weapon and to dissuade the enemy by absolutely normal offensive operations in any war, without constraints that had before been imposed by America, for example, for firing American weapons, without the shortages which necessarily can come with allies delaying supplies or changing their heart or having elections and changing their foreign policy or defense policy. Now, this is a result of 4.5 years of steady capacity growth, including for deep strike capacity. This was, I think, the hardest challenge for Ukraine, and this is the result of it. We've seen 600 drones fired, of which potentially 34 or so reached destination. According to Russia, they hit most of the drones fired. However, it is the choice of location this time which is important. Ukraine has been increasing capacity to attacking Russian strategic infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure in oil and gas, over every day now. So this has been going on since for the last couple of months, really daily attacks, which have been, in terms of impact, more important cumulatively than the attack we saw this weekend on Moscow. However, in terms of image, including the image of the Putin regime and what it can do to ensure the security of its own people in its own capital, this attack has been very symbolic, and it's not the only one, of course, on Moscow. Ukraine fired drones on Moscow before, but it is the one which busied people in and around Moscow for like much more than they've been busied before in countering this attack. And it was targeting energy facilities, according to Ukrainian authorities. However, it had the damage which went beyond that. So a plane had to be rerouted, which was about to land in Moscow airport. The airport operation, obviously, all of the air operations have been disrupted. And this is not, again, the first disruption, including in Moscow. It's a sequence, and that is the important part. The important part is not a one-off big operation, which just happens and then nothing happens. It is that it is becoming a norm, even over. Putin was even afraid to conduct the 9th of May parade in Moscow. He hesitated about how to do it and whether there would be a threat for security. And this is the main achievement. The achievement is to destabilize, to bring the war to where it started from, and also to destabilize the confidence of the regime in itself, in its own capacity to ensure its own security.
Yeah, is there any worry, I guess, that this will bring previously apathetic Muscovites, the Russian elite? They have not been on the front lines of this conflict. They are basically chilling out in the nice cafes of Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and not basically participating. It's mostly the poor people in Russia and the minorities that are being thrown into the meat grinder of the Ukraine war. Is there a worry, do you think, on the part of the Ukrainians that this could animate those people, that it could backfire in that sense?
Do you mean backfire for Ukraine, that it could be more that it could be dangerous?
Right now it's a war that basically Putin is fighting with just one small portion of the population, and not really engaging the entire country, and basically essentially assuring the Russian elite upon which his power rests, upon which the oligarchs' power rests, that this war is not going to affect them. Is there a danger that instead of saying, oh, we don't want a part of your war, that they actually become more engaged in the war?
I think that definitely when a country gets attacked, it gets everybody run to the flag, one way or the other. The calculation, I think, here is that the Russians feel the heat and they start also wondering when the end of the war is going to come, that they actually will start, instead of not caring about the outcome of the war, the majority of population would start, or at least the elite population in the capital would start wanting the end of the war. This is something that might have been Ukrainian calculation. In terms of the engagement, I think that it is incorrect to think that the war has been an exercise orchestrated by very few in the Russian government, to which this kind of poor classes of the population, so to say, fell victims. I think that by now we have enough analytical writing and exposure of the mechanisms of how the militarization of economy, of the brainwashing of the Russian population, and the idealization of the war within the population, to understand that the whole society is already mobilized, has been mobilized. Whether the whole society wants it or not, one way or the other, not only every Russian company, to say nothing of Russian oligarchs, which are own big businesses, of course, but also foreign companies which employ people in Russia, they must abide by the Russian law, which then obliges them to provide people to the army, to have a certain amount of recruitment going on in their companies, to pay taxes which feed the Russian war machine, or to convert part of their production toward the militarized part of the economy. At this point of the war, which is totally incomplete, even though there hasn't been a total mobilization of the Russian population, the population is very much engaged in military production, and this even for teenagers, even for people who are very young, after school, they happen to be engaged in military production. The heads of regions are engaged in either the work with the population or recruitment of the population or paying certain dues in order for the war, toward the war effort. And so the whole society eventually gets engaged, whether individual people here and there may be feeling frustrated or fed up or indifferent. The society is really at the service and has been at the service of the war since the very beginning. Now, whether these attacks are there in terms of retribution, I don't think Ukrainians are afraid of the retribution, because they are facing, Ukrainians on the other hand, they are facing total war. They are subject to full mobilization of their population, and they are facing nightly bombings and attacks of the same nature as Moscow has been facing just over these last few days, and but over the last 4.5 years. And it is only natural that at this point, when Ukraine feels that it has built up enough military capacity to be able to strike back without asking for permission, it can do so. And it would want to impose itself as a military adversary, which doesn't just take punches, but also can make punches. And this is to me, it may be a new shift in the war that, of course, we'll have to then work with it in our psychic here in the West. Oh, is this the image that we want to see? We grew very comfortable with seeing Ukrainians butchered in Ukraine, and thus grew accustomed to this media image of victims, which is basically being beaten with its hands tied behind the chair to which it is attached. And this is something that we in Europe have grown very comfortable with, and then we can think some negative thoughts about the Russians. But in reality, what Ukraine has been struggling to attain is not to remain tied to the chair, but to develop a capacity to strike back and to bring this war to the actual war footing. And this is now first of all, this is now the situation, the return of the situation. We also see some positive developments in this way, also in this direction, also on the front lines. But also, this is
Let's go to that next. Let's talk about that. Yeah, sure.
This thought, and this is the ally Europe needs. Europe doesn't need an ally which can be beaten unconscious while it's tied to a chair with his hands back. It needs a military ally which can join Europe in fighting the most dangerous, at this point, the most capable military adversary, which is Russia. And Ukraine has become and is quickly becoming this type of an ally. And Europe should not be afraid of allying with this type of a military power, rather should be happy and comforted to have a neighbor who is able to defend against a much bigger and a much more powerful and well-off enemy. Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to get at what you were talking about before, just the broader outlines of how the war is going on. We have very little picture in the West. The media has pretty much stopped covering it except in occasional reports. But what is going on in areas like, the Donetsk and eastern Ukraine, as well as, the Crimea, and is there any movement on those fronts? I have seen scattered reports that, actually the Ukrainians have made some modest victories and advances in recent weeks and months, but that those advances could all come undone in the summer. And there is also some worry about these sanctions relief that Russia is getting for its oil economy. This is one way in which the war in Ukraine is relating to the war in the Persian Gulf now. Because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, this is basically giving an advantage to Russia by taking a lot of oil off the market and forcing the U.S. in a way, forcing the Trump administration rather, to lift those sanctions. Just give us an update on what's going on in the overall picture of the conflict.
Indeed, I agree with you that the lifting of the sanctions by America has multiple very damaging effects to the Ukrainian war effort. First of all, it allows Russia to fully benefit from the Strait of Hormuz crisis. So to sell its oil no longer at the cap of $60 per barrel legally, only when we're talking about legal sales, but legally sell it at the market price, which is now well above $100 per barrel. Russia also, we have to remind, has been selling its oil illegally, transporting it with estimated 47 tankers, which constitutes the so-called shadow fleet. And there, this cash flow we cannot even estimate. But even now, with the lifting of the sanctions for oil, although it is temporary, but it can be renewed indefinitely, it has, of course, reached the result that Russian profits from the sale of oil and petroleum products for April have been astronomically higher per month than in any month since 2022, while the exports, the volumes, have been down in April versus March because of Ukrainian bombings that we have just talked about. And year on year, despite the fact that year on year, 2025 exports and first quarter 2026 exports are lowest from any annual exports of oil and petroleum products by Russia since 2022. Every year we have seen a year-on-year decline in volumes. However, despite of those declines in volumes, both on annual basis and monthly basis, we have seen a spike in profits that Russians have made because of the lifting of the sanctions, that even for this portion, which is so legally now, is possible. The second important contributing factor to the Russian profits is the restoration of the flow of Russian oil to the European Union, to Europe, via Druzhba pipeline, which on April 23rd, Ukrainians have basically reopened after it's been restored, after a tough bargaining by Hungary, led by Hungary, and backed up by the European Commission and the European countries to restore the flow of Russian oil via Druzhba pipeline, which was damaged in the bombing as a result of the war in Ukraine. Now, this as well is therefore is bringing additional billions per month to Russia. But the sanctions lifting has created a bigger leverage effect, because since 2022, the business players, the companies in the oil and gas markets, in the energy markets, have been waiting and have been really cautious about just this one thing, America lifting sanctions, not because they were concerned about the fates of geopolitics or European security, but because of the immediate concern, the business concern of what is going to happen if Americans lift sanctions, and then American companies can have access again to the Russian market, while European companies are going to be still limited by sanctions. Now, the inevitable has happened. America lifted sanctions, and now everybody is lobbying even harder to eventually basically to bring the end to sanctions, and to bring the end to sanctions everywhere, so everybody can restart business with Russia as usual. The Russians have been working very hard to reinforce this message that this kind of restarting business as usual is close, and we are this close to it, through other different channels. If we look, and if we don't take these events as a separate occurrences here and there, accidentally driven by nature, but rather as a constant effort of Russia to restore its image back in the West and to restore its presence back in Western kind of platforms, I don't say platforms of interaction, and the cultural front, right? We've seen Russia coming back through sports. Russian Paralympic as athletes have been authorized to participate in the Paralympic Games, and these are often, if not always, the same people who just returning from the front lines in Ukraine, and who were actually who incurred injured, yes, thank you, who were injured in the war. So they were there perpetrating war crimes, and now they are being awarded by the international community as Paralympic champions. The second big important comeback for Russia was the Biennale in Italy, where in cinema they were again re-allowed participation. And this is happening against the backdrop, again, of the America lifting its sanctions on Russian oil, which of course is way more important if you think about it as in its own right. However, every single occurrence is important because every single occurrence is a step that the Russian foreign policy establishment is taking toward restoring Russian full presence in every single domain of diplomacy, of which culture, sport, energy, and business are parts, right? And this is the part of Russian and of presence in the international relations on the global scene. And there you brought up the connection between the war of Russia on Ukraine, and the war in the Gulf right now, which of course also the biggest beneficiary is Russia. It allows Russia a free hand to potentially take over the markets for LNG, which has been Russian strategy since about 2010, to become one of the top 10 LNG players in the world. The biggest competitor for Russia in that market has been Qatar. Qatar is out because the strait's blocked, and because even if the strait isn't blocked tomorrow, Qatar would come back to the game with 20% less production. It isn't about to be open tomorrow either. So Russia in the meanwhile can take those market positions, especially in the very friendly context of the sanctions being lifted. And so now it's this type of sanctions being lifted, and then let's see other types of sanctions, because with LNG developments, these are some of the sanctions date back to 2014. So we'll see how that goes. But now the US has demonstrated, and the rest of the world is clearly, Europe for sure is demonstrating, how badly it needs Russian oil, Russian petrochemical products, Russian LNG in order to replace for the gap that is now being created with the exports being blocked of the oil from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, and from Qatari LNG. So this is a golden opportunity for Russia. And also it is at the same time very well positioned toward Iran, where it has with which it has signed a strategic partnership last year, and with which it has close cooperation in intel as well as militarily. So and at the same time, it is very closely connected to China, and which is at the same time its primary market and its extraordinarily important strategic partner, including in the war on Ukraine.
Just to get back to it just a little bit, and I know this is not your complete area of expertise, but you're following it far more closely than anyone else. What is it like on the battlefront right now? Is Ukraine making some advances? If you could summarize those advances, if you feel comfortable talking about that, what are these Ukrainian victories that we hear about?
To me, we are working especially on defense technology, and what we are seeing, and what can explain your earlier remark that nobody is showing anymore the situation on the front lines. This is out of the news cycle, but also another reason it may be out of the news is because it is so dangerous now for journalists to go to the front line. In general, because the front line, as we have understood it for all of their life before, has disappeared. It's gotten replaced with a kill zone of about 30 kilometers, and anything that goes anywhere near there is directly targeted and annihilated. That's why we
By whom? By Russia or Ukraine or both?
By both, because this is a kill zone. It's called like this because it's an environment completely saturated with drone presence, which means it's absolutely transparent. You cannot go inside there and film something because you'll be killed the moment you move. The technology which now dominates the battlefield, it allows both sides to see at night, to see based on the heating that a body can, for example, produce, or an animal can produce, or a vehicle can produce, right? So, and detect this way. The use of artificial intelligence is changing the targeting, the precision, the guidance of weapons, and also the bigger phenomenon that we are observing is the digitalization of the army. That's something that Ukraine is undergoing right now, and because of because of
What does that mean? What does the digitization of the army mean?
the objective of the Ukrainian army is fighting, is replacing as many people with drones as it can, because of course Ukraine, unlike Russia, doesn't have a lot of people to fight with. Now, the way to do that was to introduce the way to do that, but also the way to avoid certain shortfalls. For example, in the beginning, shortfalls of artillery, not enough weapons of all kinds, etc. And those gaps were calmed with drones. Eventually, drones do not replace artillery. This is not to say that, but they complemented artillery in a way that they took over eventually as the primary cause of casualties on the front lines. Today, about 80% of casualties on the front line, on the front basically, by both sides, are caused by drones. Drones communicate and transmit data. And the data from drones, now we're talking not just about UAVs, but also UGVs, the ground drones. If you're working in the south, on the southern front, then you are talking also about naval drones potentially. All of these data are gathered in a combat combat management systems, right? So C2s, and some of them have become very famous in Ukraine's Delta, for example, system, which started as a pretty much very grassroots initiative, but grew to become the generally accepted system, which now is powered by artificial intelligence, is serving in order to gather as much data as possible about the live performance of drones and units of people and the interaction between drones as robotic systems, in order to then first optimize the operations, award the best units, and merge the worst units with the best, so to give more possibility and more authority to the units who are more performative, to measure performance, but also to then potentially assess which technology works best, because you can see it, you get all the data organized, and then you can see this in real time, and then you can analyze which technology has failed to perform the task, to reach the goal, to accomplish the mission, which technology has been okay and which has been the best. And then that influences in turn your procurement system and your procurement choices. This is, in short, what digitalization of the army means. Now, one of the results of these and other reforms that Ukraine has been introducing, and again, we have to understand that these reforms, they are not just introduced overnight massively, and then now we understand the Ukrainian army is digitalized. It is not true. It is a process. They are starting a process. They have started a process. That the process is ongoing. However, this is the change that basically is therefore adding itself to the full transparency of the battlefield, which then disables, for example, the participation of journalists and the filming of the actual action, even disables for the most part the man-to-man combat, right? You don't see your enemy anymore. Sometimes the operator of the drones now can sit very far from the actual.
They can sit in Poland, in theory.
Can sit in Kyiv, can sit very far away from the actual drone operation, can sit not too far away, but especially since drone operators became primary targets for the enemy, this was the next step and the next step. But there are so many different steps like this that happened, which we can now summarize if we go kind of toward what's going on now is the digitalization of the army, and is the introduction of artificial intelligence in more and more weapons and in more operations, including decision-making processes and decisions of a system, right? This is where it is going, and that increases your kill chain. It increases the speed of the way you can proceed. It increases precision. It can help you basically grow your accomplishing your missions rate, so to say, without growing exponentially your army and recruiting more and more people. So that is the most important kind of the most important development, and it is the most important also in a way that here in Europe, in the European armies, that's not where we are at. And the recent, you're talking about this weekend is very eventful because of what's happening in Moscow. For me, it's also very eventful for what's happening in Europe, because this was yet another NATO exercise with the Ukrainians, which happened on May 13th, 15th. I think this was the arrest around this weekend, so to say, or last week. And the result was the same as in the similar exercise Hedgehog 1 year ago in Estonia. Only this time there were not 10 Ukrainian drone pilots, there were like 20 Ukrainian drone pilots for about 15,000 or more NATO troops from several different countries, including leading nations of NATO in Europe. And the exercise had to be stopped and restarted several times because the level of destruction, which was imposed on the NATO part of the exercise by the Ukrainian troops, which were simulating Russian attacks, and they just were using the drones to do the attacks. These attacks disabled the NATO armies several times, to the point, because these are also digitalized exercise at this point. So at a certain point, you have this percentage of your troops disabled, you just have to call it off because it is no longer useful. It's as if you lost the battle. And then they had to restart 3 times, and every time the outcome was the same. So this is also, to me, a big event, a development of this weekend, because it shows how irrelevant the NATO forces are. They didn't have just the drones. The NATO didn't have drones. They didn't have just drones. They had everything else. They had all the military vehicles, tanks, planes, everything from all the different countries working in unison. This is what got disabled. And of course, if Ukrainians can do this, if 20 Ukrainian drone pilots can do this, then the Russian army can do it for sure. Yeah. This was disconcerting. But to come back to Ukraine, the front line, one of the objectives and one of the strategies that Ukrainians have been pursuing on the level of the Ministry of Defense is to bring up the casualties that they incur on the Russians every month. And their target was 35,000 people, of dead or seriously wounded to the point of non-return to combat. How they would know this number is being achieved is they required the troops to film it, either when the drone is flying in to hit the target, or usually this is
post-battle assessments.
Exactly, and the filming, only the filmed dead bodies or filmed attack, basically, for example, with a drone and a person, would be considered that this is a hit and this person is dead, and this is how they estimated, or dead or absolutely seriously wounded, and this is how they estimated the quantity of the wounded and dead. And their target was to disable 35,000 at least a month. Then it went up to 40,000 a month, and now the new target is 50,000 a month, because they have reached the previous targets, which correspond more or less to the Russian recruitment levels. And so far, the Russian recruitment level so far. And what we have seen, and this was an important development, the recent development, is that indeed the Russians started having some recruitment kind of problems. Of course, knowing Russia, these problems can be calmed if Russia decides to just increase its mobilization effort, if it starts recruiting more people of different categories. And we've seen some of the signs of this. But we also know from September 2022 experience, when they announced partial mobilization back then, that the government is kind of hesitating to do the full mobilization because it is afraid of the society pushback. This has been, for me, these have been the most important developments. So the digitalization of the army on the Ukrainian side, the reaching of the targets in terms of killing the kill rate of the Russians, to slow or to annul the mobilization effort in Russia, and the recruitment effort, let's call it this way, and then also the deep strike that we mentioned earlier on the Russian energy infrastructure, which clearly has slowed down, stalled, and reversed the Russian increase of oil and especially oil and petrochemicals exports, which they are perfectly positioned to do right now and cannot do because of this one variable.
So what you're describing, in a way, is a kind of cyberpunk version of World War I. Where you're essentially, there is no front line. The map is ridiculous to even look at, because you're basically not talking about taking positions on a map. You're talking about virtually bleeding a country dry, not in the same sense, ultimately, as the way World War I bled the countries dry, Britain and France and Germany and Belgium and so on. But in a more virtual space, is where the battlefield is taking place instead of trenches. Wow. That is pretty wild. And I guess that is pretty incredible and a sort of new development in conflict. You see some of that kind of coming about as well in the Persian Gulf War. Before we get to that, and I wanted to ask you about that a little bit, but I also wanted to ask about Ukraine's ability to finance this and its ability to get international support. For all intents and purposes, the U.S. under Donald Trump might as well be I'm sorry, I can say this as an American. He might as well be a Putin asset in his way of operating, his personality, definitely, his worldview, and so on, and his actions as well. In a way, what he has done to Iran, as much as you might want to support it or oppose it, is very similar to what Russia did to Ukraine. What about other sources of international support? We talked a little bit about this in Paris and some of the stumbling blocks that Ukraine faces in getting the world behind it in this battle.
A lot of stumbling blocks, and the international support, of course, of the U.S. Ukraine lost when Trump became president. There was an excellent book about this, which develops this point that you mentioned, how Trump is a Putin asset, essentially, and that's by Régis Janté, a French journalist who wrote "Our Man in Washington," not Roma, Washington, a book which details the last 50 years of relationship between Donald Trump and Moscow, essentially. Now, without ever claiming that Trump is a spy or works for KGB, but exactly an asset. An asset doesn't have to be on a salary; it can just be an asset, and it can work differently. Now, how this is working now for Ukraine is that having lost the financial support of the U.S. Since early 2025. And the military support, direct military support, Ukraine has retained, however, intelligence support of America. This is an important cooperation point, and we see a lot of cooperation in defense technology and on the industry level as well. So we're not talking about big industrial production or something happening like this. What I mean is that a lot of leading Ukrainian tech companies are actually registered in the US, so they have a possibility to then develop relationships with American companies to get American investment, to therefore increase their production, to sell, and therefore to establish their own cash flow and their longevity, which allows them in turn to produce in Ukraine and to continue the war effort there, to basically supply the weapons to the government. The Ukrainian government still has the money from European support. The Europeans eventually, their nightmare scenario came true. They had to replace America, and they did that essentially. They had to replace them before the U.S. left this war. Basically, in January 2025, Europe was covering 50% of financial and military support for Ukraine, and then now it had to increase this contribution. Now, Europe at the same time was facing a lot of pushback at home, the rise of the extreme right parties in different countries. We've seen it in the elections, parliamentary elections or presidential elections. We've seen it in different shapes and forms in countries from the Netherlands to Sweden to the Czech Republic to Poland to Slovakia to Hungary. And eventually what happened was that, especially after the more recent elections in Hungary, where Viktor Orban finally lost power and left political landscape, we've seen that Europe, nevertheless, was able to continue and to grow its support for Ukraine, but it had to rethink how to do it. It couldn't anymore give money, so to say. It's becoming untenable, and a lot of the countries are in a budget situation which is very difficult, including Great Britain or France, for example. So Europe decided to lend money. And so this was the latest kind of sequence of this saga of Ukraine support, and 90 billion euros, which Ukraine should be disbursed this year, is the latest kind of positive turn of this event. Of course, Ukraine is absolutely dependent on donor support, and that's why Russia is working relentlessly to weaken the European support for Ukraine in Europe, how is doing it. We mentioned extreme right parties. We mentioned also the work with the public opinion, right? Every time in the media, and this is regular occurrence, every few months you have a new wave of the media discussion about negotiations which are gonna bring us the end of the war just any moment, and you have discussion about how Putin, or you have all of a sudden yet another cycle of the same old news discussion about how Putin may be mortally sick, or how his elites are about to rebel against him, and how short their patience is growing. Well, they've been living with Putin in peace for like almost a third of a century, but today, this week, is the week they are finally fed up, and it's going to be the end of the regime. And these fairy tales are fed regularly to the European public, but also to the European elites through experts, through the media, through their own sources on the ground who listen to local experts in Russia, and therefore reincarnate the same exact narratives. They're very few, but they're very regular, and they're regularly reserved in order to then sold out, in the sense that, oh, but wait a second, we don't have then, if the war is going to end tomorrow, then why do we need to invest more in defense here in Europe, in our own defense, and why do we need to support militarily and financially Ukraine? Because if the war ends tomorrow, where is the money going to go, actually? And of course, the Ukrainian government, with all of the corruption scandals it's surrounded with, it doesn't help at all to fight back on this narrative. And so this is the biggest danger. The danger is that with time, this support is going to wash away. What we see again with this return of the Russian actors on the sports field, in the cultural field, now more recently, more importantly, on the economic field in terms of sanctions, we can anticipate more is to come because of the energy crisis. And to me, the two wars in the Gulf and in Ukraine are becoming interlinked, because the longer the Gulf War lasts, the faster the sanctions are going to be lifted, especially on Russia, but hey, maybe also on Iran, because at the end of the day, they've been in the same boat for some time. But on Russia for sure, and it's much easier, much more convenient to work with Russia, and the business sector, especially in the energy sector, has no shortage of volunteers.
What countries other than Europe are supportive? We know Turkey, for example, is quite supportive in some ways. We know there was some outreach to the Gulf countries. Not sure what fruit that bore ultimately, but is that something that you monitored? How about other parts of the world, India, Latin America, et cetera? Is there any kind of alternative partners for either weapons or financing?
Well, nobody can rival Europe, to put a long story short. However, yes, you mentioned correctly that Turkey plays a very important role as a strategic partner, both of Russia and Ukraine at the same time, and a member of NATO on top of it. Only Erdogan can pull out something like this. And then you mentioned India. No, India has remained a very important partner of Russia for energy, has become a number 2 importer of Russian energy petrochemicals after China since 2022, and it remains an important consumer of Russian weapons, although Russia lost about a third of its own presence, so to say, on the Indian defense market, and it lost it to NATO and to Israel. So this is an important change, but India is nowhere near an independence, or nowhere near switching to NATO only or Western only weapons. No, South Korea has also been a big winner of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of energy, in terms of defense markets. I'm sorry. So having become an important supplier of weapons to Europe, Poland, especially Israel, another one, which won a tender in Romania, for example, for air defense systems. So these are the developments kind of that have been, but none of these countries, neither South Korea nor definitely not India, but nor Japan, have been really anywhere close to supplying the military or financial support to Ukraine. They are not allies in this way. Turkey supplied an important diplomatic support, including for Ukraine joining NATO, which is not in the cards, but Turkey has been instrumental in advancing that agenda in negotiation, or especially on prisoner exchange and things like this as well, but especially on including on the military partnerships with Ukraine and developing military partnerships since 2015, actually, when Turkey shot down a Russian jet which crossed its border during a maneuver in Syria. And there was a 1-year fallout between Russia and Turkey. And that was the kind of beginning of Turkey-Ukraine industrial cooperation in the military sphere, and of course, which continued basically since. Now, the new development is Ukrainian presence in the Gulf countries, and 3 countries there deserve attention. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar. And there we've seen that these countries basically called upon Ukraine in help in order to find cheaper solutions for drone interceptors, because although the vast majority of Iranian drones and missiles were intercepted with American weapons, those were extraordinarily expensive, and also not all of them were intercepted either. We saw the massive damage which was done to the energy infrastructure, in particular in the region, Qatar especially, and we saw the cost, gap which that involved, right? So one American Patriot, which would cost way above $1 million, versus a Russian Giran, which is an upgrade to Shahed drone, basically costing under 100,000. And this is this kind of gap. Also, the fact that the Gulf states don't have access to these unlimited cash flows they had before with the export of energy made them think of new solutions. And this resulted eventually in Ukraine supplying about 200, what we know from open sources, about 200 military advisors to the region. And President Zelensky, after his visit, signed MOUs with the 3 countries. And we are now waiting to see what would come out of those MOUs, because behind, of course, there are negotiations on the potential military defense industry cooperation, which could, and in Ukraine's desires, it would incarnate cooperation on co-production, co-development potentially, and sales of weapons, and potentially in exchanges as well. That could also go further if the Gulf states understand, which I think they're now understanding very well with the direct cooperation with the Ukrainian military, that it's not just about getting a weapon or producing a certain weapon. It's also about understanding how to integrate it into their existing system of defense, and also how to build the system around these new types of weapons. So smaller drones of different types, right? Ground, water, and air, but also EW systems, and also the anti-drone systems, and the smaller, cheaper weapons from smaller radars, which are a big challenge now and important in order to detect drones, but also small missiles potentially as well. So something Ukraine is also trying to work on. And Ukrainian capacity to increase and to scale missile production, not without challenges, has a lot of challenges. However, they have crossed that threshold. They are now scaling missile production, is an important step in Ukraine's popularity on the defense technology market today, when the race is not after the most expensive, the most sophisticated, the most perfect system, but the race is after a cheaper, good enough, efficient system.
And it's also, you talked about upgrading your technological setup, but it's also about upgrading your doctrine for the realistic warfare of the future. The idea that basically, you talked about it a little bit earlier, the borders don't matter anymore. Europeans, maybe in Britain, say, hey, what do we worry about Ukraine? It's all the way over there. So what if the Russians take over Ukraine? But it really is about, at this point, borders don't matter, distances don't matter. Go on.
Can we cut out a little bit here? Because I see that my child is reflecting in the furniture. I'm going, because he's quietly picking up his musical instrument.
Oh, that's cute. That's all right. That's okay. I didn't see him
on your video, which is kind of weird. behind
No, that's okay.
me.
That's charming, actually. How old is your
Okay,
child?
just look at, he's 8 years old.
Oh, great. I have a 14-year-old, and we always make jokes about, I'm doing a live, so definitely come in. And we recently just actually got a puppy in Paris. And so, now we have another factor for those lives. So, yeah.
Yeah,
You
but
never
this,
you never know. It's really about the unexpected, in both doing Zoom interviews and doing warfare and preparing for that unexpected. So, I mean, is that something that should be incorporated into philosophy of warfare right now? Because we're in a situation where if there's a will, there's a way. And, for example, we talk a lot about drones. These drones can be assembled in the enemy country. It doesn't have to be a ballistic missile coming from Russia that hits Paris or London. It can be a drone assembled off of a ship in the North Atlantic.
it can be, in theory, it can be. But what we're seeing now is you need a scale to really kind of overwhelm the defenses of the target country, right? And you are not going to assemble at scale on a ship or here and there.
Sure.
You have to have your bases, you have to have your enterprise, it has to be well hidden. So this is the kind of, I wouldn't go, it can be assembled anywhere, but not at the scale needed. You still need
Sure.
the countries, and your ballistic missile can still arrive with no problem at all from Russia. This is something that, again, like it can arrive from Iran, it can arrive from Russia. It is just, to me, what the new thing, the new development is the proliferation. The capacity now to produce smaller but very lethal weapons is really worldwide capacity, so to say. Smaller actors, non-state actors, small states,
The
non-state.
Taliban is assembling its own Shahed drones, even.
Absolutely. Anybody can assemble a Shahed drone. Anybody can assemble a missile. A small caliber missiles are being assembled by anybody. Houthis can assemble their naval drones, basically. And so this is like just whether this is effective or not, whether they are precise or not, is a different question. But the fact that there is you're no longer talking about war as an expansive exercise that only very few states could afford and which was economically ruinous and not interesting. This is no longer this kind of paradigm, which also was potentially one of the foundations alongside the nuclear guarantees and the international security system, which was a foundation of lasting, so to say, peace in most of the regions of the world, no longer is there. The war is no longer prohibitively expensive. The war is no longer reserved to big powers. The war is no longer only necessitating you to have an army of professional soldiers who know how to manipulate big, expensive, very sophisticated equipment, which requires 6 months or 9 months, 2 years to train. Now, if a drone can replace, for attack purposes, for deep strike purposes, can replace a bomber, he's a bomber drone. The pilot for that doesn't have to be trained to the same extent of time as a pilot for an F-16. And of course, not to say that this is worse, but to reach a similar effect. This is the paradox. And this kind of leads to the making war as a phenomena more inevitable and more global as well. Did the Gulf states, like the UAE, did they think in their wildest dreams that they are going to be bombed and that Qatar is going to be, and that their access from the Hormuz was going to be blocked? Like, this is crazy. Nobody has even imagined that, 1 year ago. Like, this was not something people would be willing to believe in. They
didn't think the Americans would be stupid and crazy enough to do this because they knew that the Iranians could close the strait. I mean, in that particular case.
Yeah. This is it. Yeah.
Hey, Anastasia, tell me a little bit about the Eastern Center think tank. Tell me a little bit about your project. What does it do, and where is it based? And just for the listeners and watchers to know where you're coming from.
Yeah. So Eastern Circles is a Paris-based think tank. We are focused on geoeconomics. So we're trying to analyze the phenomena in geopolitics and technology by looking at companies at microeconomic level, understanding which companies are dominating the supply chains, how they are interconnected, and looking at the region that we are most interested in, which is Eastern Europe, but also now looking at the Middle East, looking at Europe. All those companies, especially in defense sector and energy sector, tend to be connected to their governments. This is why the microeconomic approach, understanding the strategies of companies, help us understand the strategies of countries as well. And this is how we are analyzing and trying to analyze and understand geopolitics, to also foresee, to do foresight, so to say, to draw scenarios and recommendations.
And are you funded by any governments or private individuals? What is the source of the funding for the think tank?
We have diversified funding sources. We are working with foundations. We are working with governments. We are working also with companies. So this is a diversified funding base. And we are an independent think tank. So basically no one source is overwhelming, so to say. Yeah.
And this wouldn't discredit you at all, but just does the Ukrainian government help out? It would just be interesting if they were, and it would probably be a sign of, because smart countries fund think tanks.
It doesn't. And I think actually the Ukrainian government, I would not be surprised if it doesn't fund a lot of think tanks at all. Definitely doesn't fund our think tank. But we choose Ukraine as a subject of our research, and Ukrainian technology as a subject of our research. But we do not receive funding from Ukrainian government or actually at this point companies either. And just to say that Ukrainian government being reliant on allies for support, even in weapons and essential functions, doesn't have much money left for think tanks, even at home, to say nothing.
Yeah, sure. It seems like the Iranian government, that's all they do is have various think tanks providing them with information. And one of the think tanks, there are several of them actually, one of the things that they've done over the last 4 years is study the Ukraine war and use the lessons that Ukraine learned and Russia learned from that conflict against the Americans and the Israelis. I just want to say thank you so much, Anastasia Shapochkina of the Eastern Circle's think tank in Paris. It's been such a pleasure, such a great, illuminating conversation. Thank you very much. This is Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. And you can subscribe on Borzu, borzou.substack.com, or on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, also on YouTube. Thank you so much.